Hey everyone. So, this is our weekly catch-up, and man, what an interesting week it's been. I really got to figure out what to do with cameras. I mean, this is my outdoor camera. This is my setup here that I want to use. It's, as you can see, it goes good. It's got the thing. You can now see what you're watching me on. Oops. You can see what. There we go. Look at everybody just caught up. That's what you're watching me on. This right here. But anyway, this is kind of an interesting thing. I've been wanting to kind of use this, go outside and vlog, and I've done that a little bit. I'm hoping to get some other stuff going on, but you know, it's like I'm trying to really piece together how I want this to go, but at the same time I don't want you all to, you know, just disappear. And so, you know, yesterday it was interesting. Met with my deacon. I probably should figure a way to kind of set this up to kind of record what goes on, you know, or at least you can see. Excuse me. You can see what goes on. Man, that's bad. This is what happens when you do a live one. You can't edit it out. But yeah, it's one of those things where I'm just interested. I'm really seeing God move in certain ways in the life of this church. It is by no means where I want it to be, where I think it should be. But then again, my ways are not God's ways. And I think that becomes a sticking point for a lot of pastors. There's a lot of pastors out there that are doing revitalization. They have this plan, they have this idea, and they think this is the plan that God has for me. This is what God wants me to do. This is it, and they are like the reed that does not bend. You know, it's just, you're always under this tension. You're always, you know, if a good stiff wind comes, you're going to snap. And that's bad. That is bad for a pastor in the church to be in. Like, that place is not a place I want to be in, because that should not be what you're going to be in. And, you know, I'm looking at the last week and I'm like, wow, you know, this has been really good. I've been meeting now for about a month with one of my deacons, actually my only deacon, and we actually just talked it out, and we're gonna have him be a deacon for 6 months, and then see where it goes, and if he feels the Spirit leading him, we're going to make him an elder, but he's not going to be required to preach. I know that sounds weird, but he does teach in the church. He does teach the men's ministry here, and really he's got 35 years experience working with his previous church and his previous pastor, and that to me just is a lot of experience I need alongside me. And you know, we're going through this book, Reclaimed, by Bill Henard. I don't know how to. It's Henard. And you know, going through that book is really interesting because, you know, we can see parts where this church is, and we can see parts where you know, we're going, and it really has me thinking on like a whole another level, like for other pastors. You know, I look at a lot of churches out there that I know that are struggling, and a lot of churches that it just doesn't feel like anything's going on. And I've begun to kind of see something. Like I had someone ask me the other day, why do you think your church is experiencing growth? Now, I could give the Sunday school answer, God. You know, I remember when I was at one church and the pastor used to challenge us by saying, don't give the Sunday school answer. In other words, we at times get so used to how it is, or I'm trying to think of how to describe this. You know, we don't want to take any of the glory, and we shouldn't, you know, but at the same time, God has called us to be the instruments that He uses, the tools that He uses here on earth to do things. So we're walking that fine line, but it was just interesting because, you know, I see this with a lot of pastors out there that I've been talking to in revitalization, and they get really frustrated. And so, you know, this one pastor was talking to me the other day, and he's like, why do you think you're experiencing growth? And I told him, you know, I know for myself personally, I've had to put aside a lot of things. You know, I grew up the son of a pastor, and also he was in the military, and like myself, I was in the military, and so there's a lot of that stuff that gets thrown in there. And I've kind of realized where there's good parts of my military upbringing and background that work in a church, you know, organization and different things like that. But then we become too tight for micromanagement. And that was something that really kind of hit me, because I look at this last year and a half, almost 2 years now since we moved here. It is July 22nd right now as I'm recording this, and we moved here the end of October of 2018. So 21 months ago. And you know, I was trying to micromanage. Nobody could do anything except through me, and you know, it was really one of those things where this church struggled to grow, and that's actually what caused this church to go into the death spiral that it was the pastor was doing everything by himself. You know, and we look in the Bible and we see that, one, the calling of the first deacons was because the apostles knew they couldn't and shouldn't be the be-all and end-all of the church. And second, it was this thing of, you know, trying to want things the way I have felt that God has wanted this church to be, and realizing it isn't going to come overnight. You know, it's not going to ever be that way right off the bat. So it really kind of got me thinking. It really has, you know, like, this question really hit me. And so I've had a few days to let this permeate and work through me and all sorts of stuff. And so what ended up happening is, I think the first thing, if I was to say, I think the first thing was that I had to learn that I need people. And while the people may not have all the qualifications that I'm looking for, they have the qualifications God's looking for. In other words, if I look at the Bible and I see what God is calling for people in the church to be and to have for fruits and different things, it's that those are the things that I was like, okay. And I was really nervous. I'll admit. I mean, I know pastors that will sit there and they're going to sweat it and get the anxiety sweats and everything just going, because they're going to sit there and just be, ugh. But that's the one thing I started doing. I started letting go. I started letting people have the reins on certain things within the church. And we started to see an attitude shift and a movement shift, and all sorts of things started to then take place, because as we got people, we started seeing people stick. And I mean, we were praying. I'm not going to lie. My wife and I were praying for people who would be mature Christians that could come in and be used in positions. But again, a lot of these people that were coming in with the knowledge, they're not, they were not where I thought somebody should be, where I thought they were in line, everything with what I wanted. But then I'm sitting here and I'm looking and I'm like, wow, this is really different. It's kind of like we look at it, and there are churches that are elder led, there are churches that are congregationally led, but then you look at the churches where they're congregationally led and then they want to be elder led. And I'm thinking of a church I know a few miles from us, and that church just has had more people leave in the last few years, and is struggling, and they were already struggling prior to calling this new pastor. And this new pastor wants it to be elder led, but you're taking something that was this way and you're expecting them to accept it overnight. And it's one thing to talk a good talk and get your bylaws ratified and everything else, but if you do not have if you're, I don't want to say deceptive, but if you're not letting them know what being elder led is going to be like versus what they're used to, then as you're going on now under the new regime, it's going to be a lot harder to find. And I mean, that's the one thing in New England, I think, that is a difficult sell, is elder led, because we're based, our Puritan heritage here in New England is congregationally led. So I hear a lot of pastors talking about being Catholic, being and I don't mean like universal. I mean they're in a Catholic area, a heavily Catholic area, and so they're trying to respect that and try to do things that will help them understand. But at the same time, they're not used to elder led. The only other thing they know is congregationally led, and so it really rings out. So as I've come in, and we're slowly gonna probably get to elder led, it's a process. It's kind of like you have to teach somebody something, and you got to begin slow, and you got to begin wisely, and you got to begin so into a way that these people are going to understand. It's not like you founded the church. It's not like you began as a church plant, and so from day one it was going to be elder led. It's one of those things where these churches have been congregationally led, and if there's one thing I'm learning, it's learning for them, for you to give a little, for them to give a little. So in other words, when you're giving a little bit to them to help them feel like they're not losing everything, they're willing to give you a little bit more. And so we're moving in that direction, but it's not where I thought. 3 years in, it's not where I thought we would be. And I'm sitting here now and I'm saying to myself, this is going to be, maybe 5 years from now we'll be at that point, but right now we're not. So it's good, it's a good thing. But what I've seen, and getting back to the whole thing, is as we've given, as we've called people to these positions, as we've realized that there was a lot of stuff we were doing that we needed to give up in order for them to grow and understand, that has been the biggest turnaround. And I think that's what's making people stay. And I'm sitting here, I'm talking with people day in and day out, and a lot of them do not have an understanding. And I think that's the one thing we want people. In other words, let me kind of back up. So in other words, what's happening is we see people that are coming to the church, and they are they're hurt by other churches. They're how do I describe it? Their experiences that they've had in other churches have really colored them bad, and so we need, as pastors, we need to have a heart to understand what that is like, and we need to have a heart to understand that it's going to be a while. We might see people that are mature, but are we turning them away or off because of a few things that we think that they need to have, or are we willing to work with them and bring them into something? Here's a case. Talking with another pastor, has been like, he's just so focused on elders, that he needs elders. And it's like, dude, do you have deacons? And he's like, no, I don't want to focus on deacons right now. But he's got these people who he says, oh, these people would make great elders. But, it's like when you read the Bible, when you read 1 Timothy, and you're seeing the qualifications, the qualifications for both deacon and elder are very similar, but they're different. And so, this was something I was talking over here with my deacon yesterday, was we sometimes just kind of hit this thing of not realizing that really deaconship is kind of like that first step to eldership. A deacon is almost like an assistant pastor in some ways. We kind of look at the elders as being the pastors, but in some ways there is that training situation. It's kind of like, if you're a pastor, so you get a master's in church leadership or whatever, you want to say, where do you begin? And a lot of people begin serving in different capacities. So, would not be a deacon be kind of that opening step, where you can bring them into a leadership position, let them have a title, let the church get used to them in that role, and then help them grow into the elders. So that way there's kind of an itch that gets scratched for one, and an itch that gets scratched for the other, and so it works. So, that's the thing, and we're seeing that right now. We're seeing people come in, we're seeing people take these roles and kind of going with it, and it's really good. I'll be honest, I'm seeing a lot of growth in our people, and I'm loving it. And again, a lot of it is me having to let go and trust God, that God is going to be doing His work in them, so that the vision He's given me for this church is going to come to fruition. But I also have to realize that it's not going to come until I can give full control over to God. And if we don't have full control, we're going through the book of Haggai right now here at the church, and it was the last couple of weeks we've read where God is sitting there telling Israel that because their hearts are not fully on God, because they are neglecting what God wants them to do, God has stopped blessing them. God has allowed blight to come in. God has allowed them to think that they have this, but in actuality they don't have everything they need. So, it's really something where I think as a church, we have slowly started to get to this point where we are getting there. We're not there. As I've said, I'm thinking to myself, we were going to be 40 by the end of this year, and then COVID happened. And this has been the biggest lesson for me, is to see God still growing His church after the reopening, because while we still have not had too many full, all hands on deck days here, back at the business meeting Sunday, we had 30 here, and that was minus one family that was on vacation. And so if we had them, we would have had 34. And, I'm sitting there saying 40. We're not going to reach 40, but if we had 34, we're 6 shy. And we're not even, done with this year yet. So what is God going to do? And I think that is, for me, that's God telling me, stop trying to run it your way. Stop thinking that your way is my way. Just start listening and start learning to give up what you need to give up to do what you have to. And that is it. I think if a lot of pastors out there were willing to, not give up the whole ship. I'm not saying give up the whole ship, but I'm saying a lot of pastors hold back from, letting people serve in different ways. And I think, if you did, and believe me, I'm not trying to be a pessimist, or whatever the word is, where you're, do this and this will happen. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, I think that is part of it. That is part of it. There's probably other things that pastors need to work on, but I think that's a symptom of it, is if you're not willing to give up what you have and start to look to other things, then you're gonna get more and more frustrated, because you're not going to be getting the results you want. So just start praying and asking God, and maybe, like I said, maybe some of those guys that you think would be excellent elders right now, and you're just getting frustrated with them, because you need leadership. The position of deacon is there in the Bible for a reason, and do it, use it, don't sit on it. And then, maybe that's the thing. Maybe what you're expecting to have in 6 months' time isn't going to happen. You're going to have to go back to square one and begin doing something where, you're going to have to go back to square one, but then you're going to see results. I mean, I've been here 3 years. The first year and a half, almost. Yeah, first year and a half I was here, it was disastrous. I was here, the church had 6 people when I took it over. We got up to 18 people by that Christmas, so I took it over in June of 2017. We got 18 people by Christmas, and I heard people saying, look, you've grown it by 3 people, 3 times. You've grown 3 times your amount. And that was the thing. What are we doing? How are we doing it? I'm going to say, I'm losing the picture here. So, 3.5